Welcome to Lecture 4 of the Ecology Unit. So this lecture we're going to start with looking at big idea number 4 related to ecology. Biological systems interact, and these systems and their interactions possess complex properties. So this diagram here shows you levels of organization in an ecosystem. And you'll notice that it starts out with an atom. And we know that's the smallest particle. It then makes up molecules, which then go to make up cells, which then go to make up tissues, which then go to make up organs, which then go to make up organ systems, and then those organ systems make up an organism. As far as ecology goes, when you have multiple organisms, that is considered a population when they are of the same species. Now, when you put that population in with other species, it becomes a community. So population refers to a group of similar organisms live in the same habitat. Community, that refers to interacting populations. And then we have the ecosystem itself, which is a community of living organisms, and that includes everything from the plants, the animals, and the microbes. And those living organisms with their non-living components, so the air, the water, the soil, etc. That is an ecosystem. So a habitat, as I'm sure you can guess, is where an organism lives. And the second one is something that a lot of students get confused, but it is a niche. Sometimes you'll hear it referred to as a niche. But this basically refers to the organism's job or profession or its role in the environment that it lives. So each organism in an ecosystem, in a community, has a role. Either they provide certain resources, they consume certain resources, and if they are absent, then that environment's going to be altered in some way. So for example, the acacia tree provides food and shelter to acacia ants as well as spiders in the ecosystem. It's important for maintaining soil moisture and providing organic material. So if the acacia trees are all cut down, the ants and spiders now do not have anywhere to live. So the thing that you need to remember is whether it be habitat or niche, every organism has a role, and they have certain things that they have to do in order to survive. So for instance, if you have, let's look at like polar bears, right? The ice on the polar ice caps, they're all melting. And polar bears are having more and more difficulty getting food because they rely on the frozen ice in order to get from one place to the other. So if we took that polar bear out of that area, out of its habitat, because the ice is gone, where is that polar bear going to go to survive, right? They are adapted to live in that icy area. So, another example is martins. They are types of birds, and their niche is actually living in an area and controlling flying insects. They also provide food for larger birds. So let's talk about some different relationships within ecosystems. And you should have heard of all of these before, but we are going to look at a competitive relationship, a cooperative, which is also called symbiotic, more commonly, and then we have the predator-prey. So a competitive relationship, this is when an organism is trying to occupy the same niche or same habitat or use the same resources as another organism. So something that we need to look at for this is called competitive exclusion. And it's a theory that states no two species can occupy the same niche for an extended time because one species will eventually drive the other into extinction. And if you think about that, it makes sense because if they are occupying the same niche, then one of them is not going to get what it needs. So here is an example. Here actually in the United States, we have our native mussels, and this is in the freshwater Great Lake area. And then we have these mussels called zebra mussels, and this actually happened in the Great Lakes. These zebra mussels were somehow brought over and introduced. And basically what happened is that they ended up being able to survive over the native mussels because they were competing for that same niche and they had some advantages over the native mussel. So first, they are smaller, which means that they could get into smaller areas and they weren't as readily visible. Second, they have a very high reproductive rate. Very fast and very high reproductive rate. So that means that there were more of them in the area, which means there were more of them to occupy the niche. And the third advantage that they have is that they have no natural predators because they're not from this area. So what that meant basically was bad news for the native mussel. So not only did the native mussels have their habitat and their resources taken over, they were also more easily eaten by prey. By predators. Okay, so one species will have better adaptations that allow it to be more successful as well as more fit than the other. Now, when we say more fit, we're not talking about working out at the gym or going on running, marathons, all that kind of stuff. We are talking about they are more suited to survive in the area that they're in. That's what fit means. So this happens often when a new species is introduced into an ecosystem. Another thing that we need to understand is resource or niche partitioning. And this is when a species divides a niche to avoid competition for resources. And what this is basically similar species, they live in the same habitat and they can coexist if that partitioning exists. So natural selection is going to lead to adaptations, allowing those organisms to specialize in catching specific prey in specific habitats. This resource partitioning actually reduces competition. So a great example of this resource or niche partitioning is actually birds. And this gives a wide range of birds, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But even if you look outside in your backyard or even at the school, you will see there are multiple species of birds living in the same area because of this resource partitioning. So in this example, you can see that all of these birds live in the same area. But the resource partitioning comes in because they have capabilities of eating different resources. So for instance here, this black skimmer, it eats fish at the water surface. A flamingo is going to go down and feed on the organisms in the mud. A heron right here, it goes into the water and seizes fish. Not quite at the bottom, not quite at the top. So you can see all of these birds have adapted to where they can live in the same area and there be enough resources. Something else to know is called character displacement, and this is a change in features when two populations are together versus when they are separated. So for example, when two species are in one habitat, this bird right here, the Fuliginosa, has a shorter beak depth. depth, whereas the fortis has a larger depth. When they live in separate environments, these features are not common. So you can see here, these are different areas that they looked at. This area right here, both birds live in that area. And then this is their beak size versus here, when they are separate, everything changes. So that is character displacement. Now let's talk about predator-prey relationships. So predator-prey relationships, as much as some of us don't want to see, for instance, the fox eat the bunny, these allow for population control. So it is the exchange of energy, and usually it is going to result in the death of another organism. Predators actually control the prey population because without predators, the prey populations are going to increase in size until their food is gone. And then that will end up leading to starvation as well as a rapid spread of diseases. Here on the right, this is another example of something that you need to be familiar with. You don't have to memorize it, obviously, but you need to be able to read a graph and see the changes in the populations between a predator and a prey. So here is an example of a question that was on an exam. It's a very simple question, but because no numbers are given and no formula, a lot of students had difficulty with this on the AP exam. So it says use a graph above to calculate the lag time in months between the change in the densities of the prey and the predator population. Give your answer to the nearest month. So essentially what it's saying is just find the difference. So we are going to go here and we are going to pick this first loop here. So right there. And we are about right there. And then here with the fox, we're about here. So we're right around either 5 and 7 or 6 and 8, depending. But it's about, the answer is 2 months. And that's all they wanted. Okay, so predators and prey, they have adaptations to help them survive. And basically, this is due to evolution, due to natural selection. And what you need to understand about natural selection is that it basically promotes the most successful traits. And this is going to lead to coevolution between the predators and the prey. And I'm sorry, I can't spell. So, for instance, prey adaptations. Camouflage, which everyone's heard of camouflage. There is another word for it, though. It is called cryptic. So if you see that, which basically just means obscure. Then there is mimicry, which there are 2 types of mimicry. Batesian is when one species copies a toxic species. And then there is Malarian. So the Batesian, a great example of that is butterflies. So B for butterfly, if that helps you remember it. So an example of Batesian mimicry is the monarch butterfly and the viceroy butterfly. So the monarch is actually poisonous. It's actually dangerous for birds to eat monarchs, and they have learned this. So the viceroy butterfly actually mimics the look of the monarch in order to not be prey. The Malarian, I want you to think M for many, because this is when many toxic species have the same color, and due to that coloration and its frequency, it makes it an easily learned by predators. So for instance, bees, wasps, bumblebees, all of those kind of insects, we know if you see something fly around your head and you see a flash of yellow and black, you don't want to be in that area. So there's also adaptations such as deceptive markings like eye spots. There's the agonistic behaviors we talked about. And then there's also the aposematic coloration. So bright coloring means toxic. And then we have the predator adaptations. So their adaptations are mouth parts specific to food, such as the beaks on birds. And then there's venom or resistance to toxins and camouflage so that they can sneak up on their prey. And then next we have symbiotic relationships. This is when there is a close as well as permanent relationship between two organisms. They do not live apart. Where you're going to find one, you will always find the other. Sometimes this can also be referred to as a cooperative relationship. And there's 3 types. Mutualism is when both species benefit. They both benefit from the relationship because each of them gets something out of it. So for instance, the acacia ants in the acacia tree, the tree provides a home and the food, and the ants provide protection. The plants and the rhizobia that we just talked about is another example. Then we have plants and fungi that have an association that is called mycorrhizae. And this is where the plants provide the carbs and the fungus provide a greater surface area for nutrient and water uptake. The next type of symbiotic relationship is called parasitism. And this is when one species benefits and the other is going to be harmed. And the mammal usually, which is also referred to as the host, is harmed as the nutrients are taken in, for instance, by a tapeworm, which is a parasite. And it is not a predator-prey relationship because the host does not die. Other examples I'm sure you're aware of are ticks, mosquitoes, lice, etc. Then we have, finally, commensalism. And commensalism is when one organism benefits and the other one, it's neutral because it's not helped or harmed. So as an example, whales and barnacles. The barnacles are going to filter food from the water as the whale swims. The whale is not hurt. So let's talk about free energy in the ecosystems. So this is a change in free energy, and it can cause disruption like we talked about. So organisms are going to be connected through feeding relationships, and those are depicted in food chains and food webs. Now, it's important for you to understand that a food chain is a single transfer of energy being shown, versus a food web is multiple food chains all interlaced together. So the arrows of the food chains and the food webs are going to show the movement of energy through an ecosystem. So it is important that you understand the direction of the arrow is basically showing the movement of energy. So for instance, we have a plant and an insect. The insect is going to eat the plant. Who's going to get the energy? Obviously, it's going to be the insect. Here we have a shrew and an insect. The shrew is going to eat the insect. Who's going to get the energy? The shrew. Okay? Same thing here. So it's always going up, per se. So there are different levels in food webs and food chains. The first one is called the primary consumer, and it's the animal that is going to eat the plants. And then we have a secondary consumer, And obviously that's the second consumer in the food chain. And then we have a third level, which is called the tertiary consumer. On top of the consumer levels, we also have carnivore levels. So the first level would be a primary carnivore, and then of course we would have a secondary carnivore and a tertiary carnivore. Okay, so in the food chain that we have above, let's look at these different levels. So here, the first level or primary consumer, so it's the first one, is going to be what? The plant? No. Why? Because the plant is not a consumer, it is a producer. So the primary consumer is going to be the insect. The secondary consumer is going to be the shrew, and the tertiary would be the hog. Then we come to carnivores. Well, first of all, carnivore, we know they eat other animals. So is it a plant? No. Is it an insect? No, because they only eat plants. So our first primary carnivore is the shrew. Our secondary would be the hawk. And in this case, we do not have or do not show a tertiary carnivore. So an example question with this information would be, which labeled organism in the food web are both secondary and tertiary consumers? So you have to look. So we've got, here's our producer, our vegetation. So a primary consumer could be this insect. So then we would have a secondary consumer. So we could go here to the spiders. And if we keep going, this would be a secondary consumer, and that would make that a tertiary. So spiders would be one example of a secondary and tertiary consumer, as well as so could the toads and lizards. So our food webs are going to show direct and indirect relationships. All organisms are going to be interdependent on one another. And a change in one of the populations will have a direct or indirect effect on the others. The food webs are also going to show the complexity of a community, or what is also referred to as the degree of biodiversity. So biodiversity refers to the number of different species in an area. And you need to understand that the greater the biodiversity or the complexity of a community, the more stable it is going to be. So my point here is that, for instance, if something were to happen right here to this mouse, what's going to happen to the honey badger? Their population is going to decrease because their food source is gone, right? Same thing here with the snakes. Same thing here with the cardinals. And if something happens to them, then it's going to affect the eagle, it's going to affect the mountain lion, it will also affect the vegetation levels. Okay, so here's an example from an AP test. So it says a researcher is investigating relationship between the existing species diversity in a community and the ability of an introduced non-native species to destabilize the community. So which of the following graphs is most consistent with the claim that communities with high diversity are more resistant to change than those that have low diversity? So the first thing, your keyword here is that change. So automatically we know that this one is out. So this one's kind of an oddball, so let's take a look at these two first. So we can tell, looking here, that we've got survival of invaders and species diversity. So we can tell here that this is low, this is high, and this is high. But what it's asking us is communities with high diversity are more resistant to change. So this one isn't really, it's showing us an increase of these invaders. We don't really want an increase of the invaders. Versus here, again, we have low, we have high, and then this is high and this is low. So this is showing us that the higher the species diversity, the less likely it will be affected by these invaders because the invaders are actually decreasing in number. So your answer would be D. Next concept we're going to look at is ecological pyramids. So basically, these are showing the transfer of energy more or less. They can also be referred to as biomass pyramids, energy pyramids, number pyramids, because the size of each level is going to indicate the amount of biomass, the amount of energy, and the number of organisms. So each level in this pyramid is called a trophic level. It can also be referred to as a feeding level. So here in this example, right here, this big, huge thing down here, this is going to be our first trophic level. And this is our producers. And your energy pyramid should always have the producers on the bottom with the biggest amounts. Our secondary level, this is going to be our herbivores. And then our tertiary, these are going to be our primary carnivores. And then we could have another level here, and that would be our secondary carnivores. So we can conclude that the first level is going to have the highest number of organisms based on the shape. The first feeding level will also have the highest amount of biomass. And when we say biomass, we're referring to dry organic matter. So if we remove all of the water from tissues, what's left is called the biomass. The first feeding level is also going to have the most amount of energy stored in their bodies. And the reason that is called the 10% transfer rule, or the rule of 10. Only 10% of the energy stored in one trophic level will be stored in the next level. So this is going to explain why the amount of energy, biomass, and number of organisms in each level decreases as it goes up the pyramid. So for instance, if we look at this energy pyramid, how much energy is available to the tertiary consumer? Okay, so first of all, this is our primary. And then we move up. Secondary, right? But is this a consumer? No. So this is our primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer. It is not asking you how much energy is in the tertiary consumer, how much is available. So your answer would actually be the 100 joules. And this here, this is just another example. So the pathway of energy, the free energy that is consumed has three possible fates. 10% of that energy will be stored, and this energy is stored as organic molecules in the organism. Second, the energy will be converted or used in ATP. and then it will be lost as heat. Because remember, every process we lose some heat. And then some energy will be lost as waste because we cannot digest everything. And this explains why there are only usually 3, 4, maybe 5 trophic levels. Because with the loss of energy at each trophic level, there's going to be a minimal amount available to support those upper levels. So for instance, here we have 100 kilojoules of energy available in this caterpillar. Only 10% will be used by the bird. So 10 kilojoules. So primary productivity in the plants is going to be the rate at which our CO2 is going to be converted into organic molecules. So we have gross primary productivity, and then we have net primary productivity. And before I go into explaining those, I want you to think about your job, if you have a job. So basically, you go and they tell you that they're going to pay you $8 an hour. So you get out your calculator and you figure up that you're going to work 25 hours a week since you're in school, and you're going to make $200 a week. So you're all excited. That is your gross pay. Then you get your paycheck and you realize that they took out taxes, they took out Medicare or Medicaid, and so all of a sudden your $200 check just went down to $125. So that is your net total. So your gross is before taxes, your net is after taxes. So it's the same thing in these situations. So the gross primary productivity refers to the rate that energy is acquired by producers from the sun. So it is the total amount of energy received by the plant from the sun. Then there is the respiration rate. This refers to the rate in which energy is used and lost as heat. Then we have our net primary productivity. This refers to the rate in which energy is stored and is now available for herbivores. So let's look at that. So over here we have our gross, our total, right? And this is what's absorbed from the sun. And then we end up with our net, right? This is what is stored. And then we have here our respiration rate. This is what's lost. So the equation that we're going to look at is your GPP, which is your gross primary productivity, is going to equal your net productivity plus your respiration rate. So let's take a look at a couple examples using that calculation. So here we have an image, and it wants to know which of the amount represents the gross product of the forest. So you need to be able to look at a diagram like this and figure out what is our gross, what is our respiration, what is our net. So we've got here the solar radiation. It shows what's transmitted, what's reflected, and what's absorbed. This right here is your absorbed amount. So your 1.5 times 10 to the 6th. Next, it says which amount represents the loss due to respiration. Well, keyword right here says lost, so we're going to go with that. 1.4 times 10 to the 6th. Which amount represents the net? So you've got your total, you've got your, basically, here's your total pay, here's your taxes, this is what you are left with. So that would be your 1.9 times 10 to the 4th. So let's label these for you. Gross, respiration, net. The next one says calculate the amount of energy stored in the shrub layer. So it gives us the tree layer, it gives us the herb layer, and we know the total. So what we're going to do is we need to figure out, first of all, what these mean. And remember, the 4 means that there's some zeros. So this is actually 13,000. The herb layer, that's going to be 1,100. And we're taking that out of 19,000. So if you do the math, your answer is actually 4,900. Or it could be 4.9 times 10 to the 3rd. So here's an example of a lab that AP used to have students do. And I just want to make sure that you're familiar with this because of calculations. They still actually sometimes put it on the test, but it's not a required lab. So students grew Wisconsin fast plants. Day 7, they pulled out the plants, they brushed off all the dirt, and they masked them. They were then placed in a dehydrator for 24 hours, and after dried, the mass was recorded. So this is us getting the biomass. So they started out, they were 19.6. They put them in the dehydrator, they were now 4.2. So it says calculate the net primary productivity for each Wisconsin fast plant per day that was grown. So the first thing that we need to do is figure out what the actual energy was in that biomass. And it actually shows you here the grams biomass times the 4.35 kilocalories will give you your total. So we have our 4.2 grams times the 4.35 kilocalories. And of course we have to put that over 1 gram so that these cancel out. And then so our total here, I'm going to erase this so we can write the total. Our total, if you plug that into the calculator, is going to be 18.1 kilocalories. Then the net primary productivity per day per plant. So we know that it's 18.1. We know that we had 7 days and we had 10 plants. Okay? So calculate the net primary productivity. So we've got the 18.1. We're going to divide that by 7. We're going to divide that by 10 plants. So we are looking at 0.25 kilocalories per day per plant. Do not forget your units. Calculate the water percent of the 10 plants. Well, we know that we started out with 19.6. We know that we ended with 4.2. So we can say that the 15.4 grams was water. So it says the percent. So we need to take 15.4, divide that by our 19.6. We're going to multiply that number by 100. And that gives us 79% of water, which leaves us with 21% of biomass. So a caterpillar ate 2.5 grams of a Wisconsin fast plant, and using the percent biomass calculated above, determine how many grams of biomass were consumed. Well, we figured out that it was 21% for biomass, so 2.5 times that 21%, the 0.21, and that's going to be 0.5 grams of biomass. So if the caterpillar ate blank grams of biomass, how much energy and kilocalories were consumed? And we know that that's 0.5. So we're going to take that 0.5 and we're going to use that formula they gave us up above of the 4.35 kilocalories. Cross out our units there. So that equals 2.2 kilocalories. Through the time that the caterpillar foraged, its waste was collected, dried, and massed. The waste from a caterpillar is called frass. So the biomass of the frass was 0.2 grams. If there is 4.76 kilocalories per gram of frass biomass, how much energy was lost as waste? Well, we've got the 0.2 grams, and they just gave us the 4.76. Cancel our units. So we are looking at 0.95 kilocalories. 10. The caterpillar was collected when the other materials were collected and it was massed. During this time, the caterpillar's mass increased from 12 grams to 12.25. Knowing that 40% of the mass is biomass and 60% is from water, calculate the amount of biomass that was formed and stored on the caterpillar. So we can see that there was a change of 12 to 12.25. So we know that that change, there was 0.25. And they told us that 40% is biomass. So we're going to take it times that 40%. And we end up with 0.1 grams of biomass. If a gram of biomass from a caterpillar contains 5.5 kilocalories, how much energy was stored on the caterpillar? Well, we've got the 0.1. And we're going to take that times the 5.5 kilocalories. And that gives us 0.55 kilocalories. Indicate the amount of energy consumed by the caterpillar, the amount lost as waste, and the amount of energy stored. Determine the amount of energy that was lost due to respiration. Okay, so we know that we started here with the 2.2. And we also know that we just figured out that the caterpillar stored 0.55 kilocalories. And we figured out that as waste, since we decided to weigh it, that it was 0.95 kilocalories of waste. So we know that we have to equal that 2.2. So this is going to be your 2.2, and then you're going to subtract your 0.55, your 0.95, and that will give you 0.7 kilocalories lost as due to respiration. Okay, so the last little thing that we're going to talk about is a classic primary productivity lab. Again, this is another lab that they don't have us do, but want to make sure that you're familiar with it. So, basically, primary productivity refers to the rate at which light is converted to organic molecules, or, in other words, the rate of photosynthesis. So, we can measure the rate by determining the amount of reactants that are used or depleted, or we can measure the amount of products that are formed. So here, basically, what this lab is all about is that you are going to fill 7 bottles with water and algae. You're going to seal the bottles, and then you're going to write a percentage of light on each one. Then you're going to wrap the bottles like so. And one of them is wrapped in foil. So this is kind of like a screen, like a window screen type thing. And then you're going to test the amount of oxygen of the initial bottle. And then you place all the remaining on a tray. Okay? So these questions are basically common sense ones. But let's look at it here. Which bottle should contain algae that would gain the most biomass after 24 hours? Well, if you look at our choices, this one wrapped in foil, there's no light getting in there. And of course, it's going to increase the amount of light as we go down. So obviously, it would be the bottle that is at 100. The next question says, which bottle would contain the most amount of oxygen in after 24 hours? Again, the one that's doing the most photosynthesis. So again, we're going to be at the one that's labeled 100. Which bottle would contain the least amount of oxygen in it after 24 hours? The one wrapped in foil, obviously, because it's not getting any light. Which bottle would show you the amount of oxygen consumed in respiration? That, again, would be the 0% of light, because that algae in there is going to be doing respiration since there is no sun. So with that lab in mind, for the AP exam, you might be asked to calculate a gross or net primary productivity or make sense out of the data. So this is on your formula sheet. And basically, this here tells you how much was fixed. So let's look at this example. So the oxygen level in the 100% light bottom changed from 4 parts per million to 8 parts per million, and this is oxygen. And the algae produced 4 parts per million of oxygen. If 1 part per million of oxygen is equal to 1 milligram of oxygen per liter, then how much carbon was fixed by the algae through photosynthesis? So we know we have 4 parts per million. And that is going to equal 4 milligrams of O2 per liter. Okay? So we're going to plug this into the formula up above. So that tells us we need to multiply this 4 by the 0.698. And that's going to convert it into milliliters for us, which equals 2.81. Nope, 2.8, sorry. And that will be milliliters of O2 per liter. Then we're going to plug that into our second equation, which would be 2.8 times 0.536. So we know that 1.5 milligrams of carbon were fixed per liter. Example 2, if 2 milligrams of oxygen per liter was produced, how much milliliters of O2 per liter does that equal? And that's just a matter of converting. So we're going to take our 2, we're going to multiply that 0.698, and that's going to equal the 1.4 milliliters of oxygen per liter. Again, make sure that you are using your units. I know that I'm not writing them, but that's because I'm writing with a mouse. So make sure that you remember to put in your units. So then the next part is how many milligrams of carbon per liter were fixed. So we're going to take that 1.4, we're going to plug it into our other equation. So that's going to be the 1.4 times 0.536. And that is going to equal 0.75 milligrams of carbon per liter. And that, my friends, is the end of lecture 3. I will see you next time.